Thank you for joining us in the Spiritist Talk series promoted by the United States Spiritist Federation every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We'd also like to thank the International Spiritist Council for allowing us to broadcast on their channel as well. Today, we have our special guest, KIRSTEN DEMELO, who will discuss the subject of the attainment of the self. But before we turn it over to KIRSTEN, let's do our opening prayer. So if you're able to, please close your eyes. Dear God, dear Jesus, our dear beloved mentors, please bless this presentation. Please bless this opportunity for all of us to engage in the study of Spiritism. May all of us in our daily lives be in harmony with the good. May we embrace fraternity. May we embrace peace and compassion and love for one another and for ourselves. May each and every day be an opportunity for us to learn. May we appreciate every passing moment as a gift from you, dear God, the gift of life, the gift of harmony, the gift of hope, even when times are challenging. May every moment we experience be an opportunity. We thank you, dear God. We thank you, dear Jesus. Please bless this day. Amen. And now, let's welcome KIRSTEN DEMELO. Hi, KIRSTEN. How you doing?
Good. How are you, Peter? Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Sure.
So before KIRSTEN brings her words of teaching to us, let me introduce her more formally. KIRSTEN DEMELO is an active board member at the Spiritist Society of Baltimore. She was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Spiritist parents and was part of the Spiritist Society of Philadelphia before moving to Maryland in 2011. She has participated in the Spiritist Medical Congress and multiple Spiritist symposia here in the USA. Professionally, she is a registered nurse with a Bachelor of Science degree, and she has experience in critical care, case management, and utilization management. Thank you for being here, KIRSTEN.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you,
Okay.
U.S. Spiritist Federation as well for this opportunity.
Okay. Just remember, everybody, to please send in your questions because we will open for questions after her talk. Okay, KIRSTEN, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks
Thank
again
you.
for this invitation. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of this presentation today. We're so excited. We're so jubilous, if we could use that word in the correct way, to be discussing about Spiritism, but specifically from the book that is entitled The Conscious Being. I have it here just to show you if you're not familiar with what it looks like. Let's see if I can get it in there in the shot. Okay, The Conscious Being. It is a book that was psychographed by the well-known medium Givaldo Franco by his spirit mentor, Joanna De Angelis. So we are specifically going to be talking about chapter 7, the attainment of the self of this book. Now, we do want to make a disclaimer, a couple things actually. Please go and buy the book because it's absolutely fabulous, and each chapter is a immense lesson in and of itself. And this short time that we're going to be spending with you, we're not going to be able to talk about and touch on every single aspect, but just the main points. Hopefully the highlights and the purpose and ways in which we can encourage ourselves and one another to this attainment of the self. One of the other things I wanted to do today is I wanted to use this model within the field of psychology. It's called Internal Family Systems, otherwise known as IFS. It was founded in the 1990s by a therapist, psychologist named Dr. Richard Schwartz. Just as a brief thing, little brief explanation about IFS. We're not going to go into depth about it. We just want to use it to help us. We want to use it as sort of a framework to understanding how Joanna's breaking down, especially for those of us who don't have psychology degrees, or trying to understand terminology such as the super ego and the id, or the unconscious and the conscious mind, or the archetypes and things of that nature. So basically, internal family systems says that we are comprised of subpersonalities or parts. So the way this is best explained is the following. So if you've ever found yourself saying, oh man, I really would love to go for a run at the gym, but I also really just want to sit at home and eat chocolate cake. Or I really want to say something to my sister about this, but this other part of me just feels really bad for her. Or there's this part of me that really wants to go, but then there's this other part of me that just really wants to hang out with my neighbor. So if you've ever found yourself saying those things, it's just an indication that we have this dichotomous um, life inside of us. There's these multiple different parts of us that exist. Okay. And so, why that's important and why we wanted to utilize internal family systems, as it works really well with what Joanna's bringing in this chapter, is that under the IFS model, it teaches us to look at each part of ourself with compassion, and that there are no bad parts, just parts of us that might need healing, that need re-education, that need understanding, that need validation, etc., etc. Now, if in IFS, there's a whole more complex breakdown of it, but because of time, and that's not the purpose of this talk, we're not going to go into it, but you can look it up. So that being said, Joanna, this chapter, she talks about the attainment of the self. She talks about 5 major defense mechanisms. There are many defense mechanisms that are out there. We're not going to get into all of them. She doesn't get into all of them. She just talks about 5 major ones. One, which is she deems as the worst, but 5 major ones that we're going to discuss and we're going to talk about. But self, the attainment of self, is this self-discovery. It is this inevitable part, the law of progress. We are meant to get in touch with the self. And the self, that part of us that is kind and curious and compassionate, that part wants to be free. Right now we have this part of us, the ego, that wants to protect us, that wants to keep things, hidden, our true self hidden, because it fears. So the mind, we create these escape mechanisms for many lifetimes, and we bring it with us from one lifetime to a next for many different reasons. So these defense mechanisms that we're about to talk about here in just a second, they're not bad. They're just a hindrance to some extent for us attaining the self, for us allowing the self to prevail over, meaning allowing us to be authentic, be truly who we are. So, okay, 5 main escape mechanisms, and you probably have heard of some of these to some extent. First one she calls compensation. And again, sidebar, these are actual common terms in psychology. Okay, end of sidebar. Compensation, that basically is a fancy word, just saying that exactly what it sounds like. So, for instance, it's when a person is weak in one area, so we compensate by overdoing it in another area. Now, you might say, well, Kirsten, that's not always a bad thing. No, it's not. But it's a bad thing when we don't want to accept the area in which we are weak. So I might give you an example. A person who became paraplegic, or who is a paraplegic, and they decide to join the Paralympics. So they train for however long, and they become, great athletes. And so they compensate for their insufficiency of not being able to walk by becoming a Paralympic and allowing that to be the main driving force for their life. You might be saying, well, Kirsten, that's something positive. Working out is good, regardless if you have, physical limitations. Absolutely. Oh, 1000%, it's positive. But it's not positive, and when that person is not accepting of that part of them, that that is a part of their story in that lifetime that they had to experience, or that they are experiencing for one reason or another. So, escape mechanisms, compensation being one of them. These escape mechanisms have been created by our ego, by this part of ourself, to protect the other part of ourself that feels weak and fragile. But the more we make an effort to face our fears and these fragile but authentic parts of ourselves, it will become less scary. But we'll get more into that here in a minute. Let's talk about the other four main escape mechanisms. Excuse me. The next one is dislocation or displacement. There's sometimes interchangeable there, but let's use the word displacement. Displacement, you might have heard the term displaced anger. Oh, he has displaced anger, or she does. So, displacement is basically when you are angry at a thing or something or someone, but can't be um, you can't express that, so you have to express it to something else. So you can't be angry at your boss, or rage against your boss, so you go and you rage against your colleague or your dog or your neighbor or your loved one. Again, it's not wanting to see the reality of our own emotions, that we were hurt by somebody else, and so my hurt part, the famous phrase hurt people, and it's true, because those hurt parts of us, going back to the IFS model, those hurt parts of us, when we don't heal them, they react, and so we displace that anger, because the ego's way of trying to deal with life, and also trying to not endure the horrible reality of this, of this self, of this, oh my gosh, I'm a frail human being. It's so fearful of going to that part of ourself. So it creates these escape mechanisms. The next one, or next two, are similar: projection and introjection. Projection is exactly what it sounds like. We are projecting our own insecurities, our own vices onto others. So perfect example of this, or one example of this, that Joanna gives in the book, is that of a man walking on a street, and the man bumps into another man. And the man bumps into him and says, "Hey man, what are you doing? Like, are you blind?" And the other guy turns around and says, "Well, actually, I am blind." And then so the guy responds, "Well, well, watch where you're going." Well, the guy was blind. So, you kind of have to have some compassion for him. But because that person who got bumped into, ha- their escape mechanism, they don't see their own, or don't want to see their own lack of compassion, their own emotions and feelings, they project it onto someone, to this blind man that absolutely is not deserving of it. We're just projecting. And introjection is exactly the opposite of projecting. Intro meaning in. So we take on the values and the beliefs and feelings of other people. This escape mechanism is most wildly known with Stockholm syndrome. And if you're not familiar with Stockholm syndrome is, it is when, for example, a person gets kidnapped and then begins to either love their kidnapper, or they begin to, have different feelings for their kidnapper that is good. And they begin to feel like, oh, this is a partnership, or they begin to have very bizarre feelings. They begin to feel, take on the emotions, the feelings, and the beliefs of the kidnapper. And again, that's a way just that the ego creates, so we don't have, because it fears us facing the reality. And if you think about it, and we'll talk about one last, and as Joanna calls it, one of the worst escape mechanisms, but we have to think about it, that, and she mentions this in the chapter, that these escape mechanisms, they do serve a purpose. These are parts of ourselves that have been generated to protect other parts, other weaker parts, or seemingly weaker parts of ourselves that we aren't yet ready to face, or have been afraid to face. And we cannot and should not, and Joanna reminds us, we should not push anyone to just face themselves, because we have so much going in, so much of a background and a history of traumas in this life, past lives. If you just force someone to look at themselves and they have no resources to how to manage all of those emotions and parts and that come up, they can really become undone. They really can become unstable because they don't know how to manage it, and they really can become worse. So it's important that we also, both as spiritist educators, as people that care about other people in society, we don't push other people to see something that they're not ready yet to see. But we can encourage people to have self-compassion, self-love, and encourage and teach people. And Joanna goes into that, and we will go into that. Some of the resources we can utilize to help build up our strength. Okay, so I digress, going back to the last escape mechanism we're going to be talking about today, rationalization. Joanna calls this the worst escape mechanism. Why is that? Because rationalization is when we use logic to justify our wrong deeds. So, for example, you might say, well, I cheated on this exam, but I only cheated on like 2 questions. Like, it's not that big of a deal. Like, it's just 2 questions out of like 100. Like, it's fine. Like, it's not that big of a deal. Like, it's not, even if I had gotten it wrong, um, you know, it wouldn't have been bad. So I'm rationalizing, right? Or you might say, you're walking out of the bank, you walk into your car and you find an envelope full of money, and you quickly pick it up and put it in your bag. And as you're driving home and you're thinking to yourself, well, God wanted me to find it. It was God's will for me to find it. So you're justifying it. Or, well, someone else would have gotten it and stolen it or taken it. Might as well be me because I have, bills to pay. So if everything happens for a reason, I guess God wanted me to, you know, get this money. Again, justifying something that in reality we should be walking back to the bank and saying, hey, someone dropped this money, found it outside. Because ideally, right? Gosh, we would want someone to do that for us. We would hope so, right? If you had gone to the bank, perhaps to get a down payment on a car or a house or what have you, and imagine dropping that envelope and then reaching your destination, and realizing you don't have it. I mean, it's quite sad. So, rationalization being one of the worst escape mechanisms because we're rationalizing, we're justifying the reasons why it's okay for us to do these bad deeds. Well, it's okay for me to cheat on my husband or my partner. Well, because they had a stroke and are stuck in a nursing home, or because they don't really love me anyway. So it's totally okay for me to do that because it's not like they're going to know anyway. Or I'm just going to lie to my spouse because it's just convenient, and because it'll hurt them anyway. uh, no, those are just justifications that we make. And all of these escape mechanisms and all of this that we do stems from fear. It's created because the ego is afraid for us to face who we really are. And some of these escape mechanisms can lead to psychopathologies, Joanna tells us in this chapter. There are people that have clinical phobias. Sometimes, yes, it does come from past lives, traumas from this current life, or even our upbringing. So it tends to be a mixture of many things. But still, fear and the way that it works in the very beginning is something that we need to note, is that it installs itself very subtly in the beginning and even uses logic, right? The same as the rationalization. For instance, with COVID, in the beginning, there have been many people that were scared to go outside or to mingle, to leave their homes, to go back into the office because, they fear, getting sick. And then that fear begins to take over the psyche, Joanna tells us. And we begin to experience this excruciating insecurity, she says, filled with terrible nightmares. So it goes from something that's seemingly small and insignificant and even logical at some point to something really extreme. Why is that important? That's important. And again, pulling from the IFS model. If you've just joined us with the IFS model from Dr. Richard Swartz, you can Google it. The IFS standing for Internal Family Systems. It's not spiritist, just using it as a way to understand the teachings that Joanna is bringing to us. So, and this IFS model of fear being fear as it insinuates itself slowly. So, from an IFS model perspective, if we begin to be cognizant of each part of us that presents itself. So let's say in the beginning, I'm having this fear like, oh gosh, I'm scared of going outside or I'm scared of getting sick. So we learn with the teachings of Spiritism, especially with Joanna DeAngelis's works, her psychological series. I mean, this book in particular, The Conscious Being, really it is about coming in contact with the self. And before we can actually reach the self, we have all these escape mechanisms, all these mechanisms of protection and stopping us from reaching that self, because we have this part that's scared. We have a large part of us that's scared to face who we are. But but if we address issues as they arise and don't allow them to build up and build up and build up, which is generally what on average we tend to do from one life to another for many reasons. And this is not judgment. This is just, what happens. But the ideal behavior is that we are facing our fears. And so it came to our mind is that it's analogous to, do you remember when you were a kid and there were, the scary monsters under the bed? And maybe you were 6, maybe you were 7, maybe you were 4, maybe you were 10. And and you hear things under your bed, or you imagine you hear things under your bed, so you grab the covers, pull them over, and you just stay there. Well, life is kind of like that. If we stay on that bed with the covers covering us and not wanting to face it, our fear is immense and intense. But the moment we pull away the covers, we put our 2 feet on the ground, right? Even metaphorically, this stands as a metaphor, right? We put our 2 feet on the ground and we go to face this supposed monster under the bed. We realize a lot of things. One, hey, I'm a little bit stronger than I thought. There's this part of me, the self, that is confident. And there's these parts of us other parts of us that will see that we can do this. I can accomplish this. So we face our fear, or if it's a fear in the closet, there's a monster in the closet. So we go and we walk over to the closet and we open it. And once we face it and realize, well, this isn't so scary after all. I'm still here. I didn't turn to dust or to stone. I'm still here. I'm still living. I'm okay. And that is also just part of that process of facing our fears. One of the greatest fears that Joanna talks about is death. We fear death immensely. She even quotes Freud, where Freud says that the instinct of death is greater than the preservation of life. And Joanna says, yeah, he's right. It is. Why is that? Because we live so many lifetimes that we know we're going to die. We know that. It's so much, that feeling is so much more stronger. That's why people who fear death, it's so overwhelming. But she tells us to face that idea of what we think or what is death. Passing from this vessel to this spirit, to this physical realm to the spirit realm. And if for those of you who watched one of the recent launches, I believe it was Jeff Bezos' second launch, and I think it was William Shatner that was on this particular ride where they go into suborbital space and they came back down. And there was a moment in the interview when the reporters were interviewing, and William Shatner, he's an actor from many moons ago, or perhaps still is. He said something really interesting. He was saying he was so amazed by this experience of going into suborbital space. And he said, Is this what death is like? Is this what death is like, where we're disconnecting from this physical?" And he begins to get emotional because there's the part of him, that self, that divine being within him, seemed to have been triggered, and he got so deeply emotional over the experience. I'm sure it was life changing for him, and facing that, like, and once we begin to face these things, it's not as scary. The boogie monster or the monster in the closet, once we open that door or pull the sheets off and look under the bed and face it, it becomes a million times less scary. And it's not as scary as what these parts of us or these escape mechanisms or the ego really makes it out to be. Now, sidebar, don't think that the ego is some horrible monster that you have to get rid of. The ego has its part. The ego is important. It has its purpose. But just like anything else in our um, evolution, sometimes there are parts of us that develop to protect us. Like fear that develops from, that has been with us since the animal kingdom. Fear in the animal kingdom means, preservation of their life. But now, as human beings, I don't have to face the lion, coming around the bend. I don't have to fear a predator per se, even though there are predators out there. But I don't have to fear, for my life walking outside. So it comes a time where we have to reparent ourselves. We have to re-educate these parts of ourselves with compassion, not looking at the part like, gosh, why do I feel this way? I'm spiritist. I shouldn't be angry. I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't feel this way. No, we need to turn that around and say, okay, the reality is I feel this way, but I would like to work on that, heal that part of me so I can sublimate it, so I can progress, so I can access my self, the self that is connected to the divine. So, those are some of the things that are important for us to remember. And one really interesting thing that Joanna brings about in this chapter is, and it's on page 118. And this is so significant because we have, for the longest time, tried to understand things such as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. If you didn't know what that acronym stands for, PTSD, anxiety, depression, postpartum depression, PTSD in veterans, and or PTSD that happens with people that are not even in a war, but are just go through traumatic experiences, or why one particular trigger that happens to someone, why all of a sudden, like, it's like Pandora's box or the floodgates that just open up. So on page 118 of this chapter, really interesting, she says that, and we know, right, as spiritists, we live many lives. Okay. So she says excuse me, irregular behaviors, harmful activities, and perverse deeds that never came to light in a previous life, might even be a current life, but most likely in a previous life or many lives. Irregular behaviors, harmful activities, or perverse deeds that never came to light, meaning no one ever found out that I did those things, or the judicial system wasn't advanced back then. There was no DNA sampling, or there was, it's completely different, decades and decades and decades ago. Science is much more, forensic science is much more advanced nowadays. So Joanna says that these things that we've done, they become recorded in our deep conscience, deep within us, that demand reparation. So when we talk about in Spiritism that the laws of God are written on our conscience, we cannot run from it. So the things that we've done, even though we don't cognitively recall what we've done in a past life, Joanna says that we have something called emotional memory. So try to imagine it as little air bubbles going to the surface. of water of the ocean, right? There's like little bubbles that come up and you see them float up, right? So that's kind of like emotional memory. It's like despite that we have this forgetfulness of the past, what does not get forgotten is this emotional memory. That's why on this chapter, on page 118, she says these irregular behaviors, these harmful activities, and these perverse deeds, they get recorded in our conscience, and they are demanding reparation. They want us to pay for what we've done. They demand reparation. So what happens? So this is how the beginning of how she explains how some people go from seemingly having, some insecurities here and there, some fears here and there, to having something trigger something. It could be a traumatic experience. It could be childbirth. It could be a minor traffic accident, a car accident. It could be your cat dying. It could be a loved one dying. Anything that potentially that could trigger this memory from the past. And that's when we go from having this, initial insecurity and some fears to this really perturbing, anguishing fear. And that, although she doesn't state it, but we can sort of deduce that that's analogous to when people experience such things such as PTSD or clinical depression, clinical anxiety that requires therapeutic treatments. So and again, let us remind ourselves that none of this, that what we're talking about, none of this that Joanna is talking about is to be utilized as a tool to measure or judge somebody else. It's an escape mechanism, right? It is. When we are hearing these things, and instead of, going inside of ourselves and seeing where, if we have any of those things or where we identify with those things, we begin to think about other people, because already the ego is like, oh no, I don't have any of those things. I don't do any of those things. I'm going to start thinking about how my mother, my father, my sister, my uncle, my neighbor, my one of my friends at the Spiritist Center or at my synagogue or at work, and oh yeah, this person has that totally. Again, it's never us, but it is. And we must, with compassion, look at ourselves without judging ourselves and say, okay, well, what's going on with me? What parts of me are here? And let's try to heal them. That is our goal. Joanna says self discovery is a wholesome therapy. Wholesome. And the more we begin to identify the causes, we can liberate ourselves. We can find freedom. We don't have to stay stuck in these fear-driven lifestyles. Instead, we can come to know the cause that is responsible, as Joanna says, the cause that is responsible for the fear. And instead, we can utilize what she calls positive causes. We can shield ourselves by putting one's trust in positive causes. So if I'm able to face the fear, know know what's responsible for the fear, and instead of putting all of our energy into that, putting our energy into positive causes. And that could be our faith in God. That could be our faith in ourselves, our faith that we can do the work on ourselves, that we can handle whatever comes, our way. Because sometimes fear is this part of us that actually believes that we're going to disintegrate into dust and we're going to become nothingness if we face this. But once we talk to that part of ourselves, again, pulling from the IFS model, once we face that fear and talk to that part of us and offer it compassion, we can offer it healing. And it can see that, look, I can deal with the situation. We can put our trust in God to know that whatever is meant to happen is going to happen, and I'm going to have the strength to endure it. and I have the resources, and I have the support systems that I need. We look at all the positives. And in order for us to reach this attainment of the self, Joanna says, we have to be honest and loyal to ourself while simultaneously really working hard. Excuse me. And it brings us to this conversation that we had recently with a dear friend of ours, a colleague, I should say, in the field of medicine, and we were having this back and forth discussion about our patients and different ailments and what have you, and all the new therapies that are out there and alternative approaches and the complementary and alternative medicine that's out there. And she said something to me because I had been saying to her, there's meditation, there's all these things that people can do. It's at their fingertips. With YouTube, you can go on. You don't even have to subscribe to an app. There's so many things that so much more accessible than they were 50 years ago. But then she turned to me and she said, Kirsten, if it were easy to do, not saying that we don't have access to it, that we can't do it, but if it were easy, so many more people would be doing it. It's because it requires hard work. And that's what Joanna tells us. Being honest and loyal to ourself whilst doing the hard work on self-discovery. It is hard work. It is hard work. There's no doubt. And it's work every day. It's work every day. And this kind of is analogous to if you come from a different country. Let's use the example of, let's say you come from China, you grew up there, Chinese was your first language, and you moved to the US in your adult years, and you have to acclimate here. And so you learn English. But many people whose first language is not English will tell you that they become mentally tired as much as, physical exhaustion is a very real thing. Mental exhaustion is also a very real thing. So yeah, it is work on ourselves. It is. It does mean we have to face our fears, to face who we really are. And please do so with the help of a therapist if need be. And Joanna says, attainment of the self is a process, and we should use the recommended therapies for sure, but also simultaneously. And by the way, therapies can be a therapist, a life coach, psychiatrist, whatever you need that's specific for your needs. But she says simultaneously, we need to be utilizing prayer, meditation, and noble deeds. Hmm. Prayer, meditation, noble deeds. On this journey of self-discovery while we're doing therapy, to utilizing these tools as well. And there are others that she's mentioned in other books. She's mentioned, yoga and other books, the importance of eating healthy, and there are many resources and ways in which we can attain, depending upon, what we require, what we need, what our needs are. But these three main things, well, actually four: therapy, prayer, meditation, and noble deeds. And let's talk about noble deeds for a second, because noble deeds can encompass a whole lot. I mean, yes, it can encompass charity in its varied forms, but noble deeds go far, can reach far and beyond the physical realm, much more than what we even realize. So let's give an example. I heard this story recently. It was in a spiritist book. I don't believe this book is in English. And Daniel, you had mentioned this book recently in one of your talks. So it's a story of this spiritist center. It was a mediumistic team. They were having their mediumistic meeting, and this really perverse spirit gave a communication. And he said, I want to tear down this spiritist center. I'm going to destroy all of you. I hate you all. You're all horrible. I'm going to do everything I can to dismantle this organization. And so the wise and benevolent mentor of the group said, listen, give us some time to work on ourselves. Give us like 2 weeks. So the spirit said, okay, I'll come back in 2 weeks. So the group went on. doing what they do, living their lives. And one of the particular mediums, she was at home one day and she heard a knock at her door. You know, someone's knocking at her door. Who's knocking at my door? So she opens the door and sees a man who she does not know and who looks rather agitated, kind of a little bit like maybe he's homeless or maybe it's just, we don't know, just looks unwell. But he says to her, Miss, I need work. I need to make money. Is there anything I can do in your house that needs fixing? I'm good at fixing things. So she looks at this man who seems a little bit on edge, a little agitated, but who also at the same time looks genuine, like he really needs work. So she thinks about how she actually is having an issue in her bathroom with one of her faucets. And she says, yes, sir, actually, I'm having an issue, yada, yada, yada. So he goes up to the bathroom, he fixes it for her. She's super grateful. And then she feels inspired to obviously pay him, but pay him much more than what he anticipated. You could say she gave him a huge tip, right? So she gives him the huge tip, and then immediately after receiving the money, he turns to her and says, Miss, can you tell me where the closest supermarket is? I need to get food for my family. Like urgently, we need food. And she says, oh yeah, you go up this street, turn left, go here, and it's right there. He said, oh, thank you so much. And he goes. And then she just, doesn't think any more about it. He goes off, does his thing. She doesn't hear from him again. Okay, so time goes on. The 2 weeks pass. They go back to their mediumistic meeting, and that same perverse spirit comes back and communicates. And he says, "Hey guys, remember me, the perverse one? I'm back. Told you I'd be back. 2 weeks this time. I'm back, but I'm here to tell you and let you know I'm actually not going to be bothering you anymore. I'm not going to bother this group. I'm not going to dismantle anyone. I'm not going to try to disorganize anyone. I'm going to leave you guys alone." And so the group is kind of silent, like, okay, why? Aren't you thinking why? Like, why did the spirit decide to do that? Well, the spirit explained himself. He said, I'll explain to you why I made this decision. Well, one of your mediums were visited by a gentleman, and she helped this gentleman. And this gentleman is my incarnate son, who is suffering tremendously from poverty and all kinds of other issues, mental, emotional. And the fact that she so caringly and lovingly bestowed her kindness above and beyond, it's touched my heart so much that I'm going to leave you guys alone. So, and the story ends. So when we think about noble deeds, when we think about the good that we can do, even if we don't participate in a mediumistic meeting, even if we're not spiritists, the good that we do, it affects so many more people and things than we could ever imagine. So those good deeds that we're doing, however small, it's not necessarily something where we have to actually give money. It truly can be offering our authentic self to someone is a gift. Joanna tells us in this chapter. It is a gift because when I extend my authentic self to someone else, I'm stimulating them to do the same. And if we're ever scared to say, well, oh, I don't want to be like who I am because the world, I have to be cool and use slang and all this stuff to be accepted. But really, there's that part of me that just wants to be warm and accepting and loving towards others and smiles a lot. Be that authentic self. And don't be afraid to ask for help and to seek help when we need it. Joanna says the purpose of this life, and we are going to use an acronym, HEMI. She says the purpose of this life, of our incarnations, is for us to utilize our human, emotional, moral, and intellectual abilities for the attainment of the self. That is the purpose. And if we look at our lives and all that we endure and all the hardships and all the struggles that we go through and everything that we experience, at the end of it all, the bottom line is the attainment of the self. And it's a process. Having to heal and find healing for the ego and these parts of us that are scared or that have been traumatized. Now, our inner child that might have experienced trauma, that's still there. The famous psychologist Eric Erickson says something really interesting, and Joanna also validates this. You know, Eric Erickson said that whenever we experience trauma at any of one of our developmental stages, we remain at that developmental stage emotionally. So, for instance, if you experience a traumatic experience at age 10, you might physically grow up, obviously, and become an adult and live an adult life, but there's a part of you that's still just 10 years old. That traumatized part, until it gets healing, it's going to remain and believe itself to be 4 years old. So, friends, fear served its purpose. But now it's time that we face our fears, face ourselves for who and what we are, not in a judgmental way, not in a hateful way, but in a compassionate, curious, and loving way to bring healing to ourselves. Because once I begin my journey of healing, the world around me begins to change. I become one more who's working towards self-healing. And then inevitably, that becomes contagious. Inevitably, it's going to affect those around me. So we're doing double good for us and for society. So, dear friends, these are the thoughts that we are sharing from our dear Joanna DeAngelis from this book, The Conscious Being. Again, this is specifically reflections from chapter 7, The Attainment of the Self. But we find that her words are so pertinent and so important for our journey here in this life to not lose sight of, and to not lose this opportunity of this life, to become at the end of our lives when we reach back the spirit realm, to be what Andrea Louise calls in NOSSOS a completer, someone that completed the task that we set out to do in this lifetime. So, dear friends, we wish you all the best and joy and happiness and courage to begin this process, to begin this journey. And always remember, in the Spirit's book, they tell us that when we pray, it's spiritual CPR. We created this acronym because they say in the Spirit's book, when we pray, the good spirits will give us 3 things: courage, patience, and resignation. The courage to face, because courage doesn't mean that we don't have fear. Courage just means that we're willing to face that which scares us. Patience, to be compassionate and understand that it's a process. And resignation, not to just give up. Resignation is not about giving up. It's about accepting that this is what it is. Let me try to deal with it. So, dear friends, thank you so much. And come to the end of my talk.
Thank you, Kirsten. It's very inspiring. I think Joanna DeAngelis ought to be essential studying in every Spiritist center.
Right?
There's so much rich material there.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Oh gosh, yeah.
And courage, patience, and resignation, if most of us can just work on those things alone, it does a great deal. It's like a multitude of progress.
Absolutely.
I believe we have some questions.
Okay.
Okay. Here's the first one. If Spiritism places a lot of emphasis on the power of thought, both positive or negative, are we causing harm by having negative thoughts?
So yes, great question. So yes, by definition, perpetuating negative thoughts can bring us harm and even negatively impact those that come in contact with us or are around us. At the same time, we cause more of a hindrance to our own attainment of the self if we begin to be angry with ourselves about having negative thoughts. Because negative thoughts are just a byproduct of whatever we're feeling, right? Because if I'm feeling alone or scared, then I start thinking all these negative things. So we need to dive deeper into why we're having those thoughts and what's behind that part of ourselves. What part of us is feeling, or what are we feeling? First of all, to discover what is that the feeling behind the thought, right?
Mhm.
And then to dive deeper into that with the help of either a therapist or using other resources. You can utilize prayer to ask your mentor and guide to help you to understand why you're having these negative thoughts, and that you want to better understand yourself. Being authentic, and that's the important part, right? Really wanting to understand why I'm having these thoughts and not just wanting to repress them, because repression just means it's going to come back later in a different time.
Mhm. Absolutely. It's also, as you were, I think, just suggesting, it's very important that if one needs to find a therapist, one should not be afraid to
Sure.
do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Why is it such a struggle for us to admit to our negativity?
Great question. I believe it's because, and studying Joanna's in Spiritism, it's because we like to attribute more positive things to ourselves than what we really have. We want to believe that we're great, and in some ways, again, that's a part of us that is a protector part of us that wants us to be this great person, because deep down we can be. But the reality is that we're not, and we need to face the reality that we don't have all of these great qualities yet. But we need to work towards them, and then that's a doable thing. And it's just fear. It's fear that uh, wants us to believe that we're somebody else when we're not. And that's kind of where introjection comes in. We're afraid to see the reality, so we take on the reality of somebody else because it's too great for me to deal with.
Very important point.
Hmm.
Okay, next question. We worry about the future constantly, generally for things that in the end will not happen. How to overcome these worries?
It's a great question. And some might not like my answer, but it's the answer that Spiritism gives us. And it is a hard pill to swallow, but it's about having faith. And when Joanna calls the positive causes, putting one's trust in positive causes and trusting the process that whatever we're going to endure, everything's going to turn out okay. And I remember many years ago, many years ago, I got this inspired thought, and I always like to think maybe it's from my mentor or something like that. And I was experiencing this anxiety, this fear of the future, or fear of how things were going to turn out. And this thought came to me, and it was like my mentor said to me, well, if I were to tell you that in the end, everything's going to end up okay, how would it make you feel now? Not really knowing. But if I told you it's all gonna be okay, how would you feel? And I said, I feel calm. Like, okay, well, in the end, it's gonna work out. I feel calm. Well, that is the reality. In the end, all things will work out. They will. One way or another, things will be okay. I deal with this in the medical fields. And let me actually, before I go on, let me say this. It's not easy to just say, I mean, it is easy rather to just say, well, have faith, just trust, because we have to have the ability to internalize that. And sometimes our fears are so intense and so excruciating is the pain of this fear and the despair that it causes, that in that moment, I cannot take in that faith. That I need to go through some therapeutic techniques with appropriate therapies, whatever they are, sometimes with medication or other things as well, to enable me to reach below these many layers. you know? So it's not something that's going to be easy. If it was, everybody would be doing it and we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't be doing this live right now, and there would be no need for any of this because we've all, you know, attained it like that. But that's not the reality, right? Because if dieting and exercise were easy, we'd all be thin and looking great. But that's not
Okay.
how it is, right? So it's hard, and it takes a lot of work. And we
And
have
we
so many.
would, yeah, we would
Go ahead.
miss having you here too. If
Yeah, that too,
um,
right?
yeah, it's the way, I mean, faith really is a process, and it's one that requires a lot of patience, doesn't it? Yeah,
Yes.
to
Yes.
obtain it, because it's not something that's going to happen overnight.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's see if we have another question.
Sure.
Kirsten, can you elaborate on the relationship between the ego and self-esteem?
Between the ego and self-esteem. Well, let me make a disclaimer. I'm not a psychologist, and I am still yet studying about um, Jung and Freud. I mean, you know, it's been years, but having to refresh your mind between the ego and the superego and the id and all those things. But the ego has its purpose.
Mhm.
The ego, it's not, the ego gets a really bad rap. The ego doesn't want to, it wants for us to feel good.
Mhm.
So the relationship between the ego and self-esteem is that in the ego's what's the word? In the ego's purpose, it believes that it needs to protect us, so it creates these escape mechanisms. So in its own way, it's a protector because it wants us to maintain some sort of semblance of self-esteem or self-love or peace or harmony, except it goes about it in a bad way. It goes about it in a way that for long-term use, it's not good. Perhaps temporarily in the moment when we're experiencing something that's really overwhelming and traumatic, it serves a purpose. Even Joanna validates that. But there comes a time when we need to unravel that and realize that, you know, we need to face the reality. We need to face our fears.
Right.
So that's as close as to an answer that I can give you in regards to that.
Okay. All right. See if we have one other question? To what degree is attainment of the self a process of letting go of the self?
So I wouldn't say, and forgive my ignorance on the topic too, I wouldn't say that it's about letting go of the self, because the
Mhm.
self is what we want to obtain, but
Okay.
it's about letting go of other parts of us that no
Mhm.
longer serve us.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
the part of us that has the escape mechanism of compensation or deflection, or, you know, projection or whatever it is, had its purpose for a time, but then there comes a point where we have to let it go. And it actually really is, and we've experienced this, it is a process of mourning, because we
Mhm.
become so attached to these parts of us, um, that, you know, it's so hard for us to let it go, because it's been our crutch, right? Uh, Peter, you and I were talking about this before we
Mhm.
started off
Mhm.
air about, you know, using PowerPoint, and me not using PowerPoint because you know, for me, in my mind, it could be, for many of us, it could be like a crutch, and we kind of want to do away with the crutch.
Right.
So, but it becomes like it can be a mourning process where we're grieving the
Mhm.
loss of that part of us,
Mhm.
but we need
Right.
to work on ourselves and be compassionate towards that part. Thank that part of us that served its purpose, that did protect us for a time. Thank it, but let it know that the self, as Joanna calls it, and many other in psychology, the self is capable of prevailing, of succeeding, of loving,
Mhm.
of being okay about being authentic.
Right. Yeah, it's not a complete abandonment of the self, which would be impossible, but letting go of the self that we have moved beyond in some way.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
All right. We have one last question, I believe. Yes. Pride is a word that is commonly misinterpreted. Can you talk about the positive, negative implications of it?
Yes,
Mm,
pride.
mm,
Oh, the foe of humanity,
mm,
pride. Pride and selfishness, they tell us in the gospel, is what keeps us furthest from God. And I'm trying to pull up something real quickly, if I can, that Joanna talks about a little bit about pride. But basically, again, the way in which we look at pride, and it can be misunderstood because sometimes people think that,
mhm,
well, having self-esteem, I'm proud of what I've done.
mhm,
There's a difference between, pridefulness and just being happy that you've accomplished what you set out to accomplish.
mhm,
There
mhm,
is a difference. And only you yourself and God can know what that difference is, because it's easy for us to say, oh, that person's so prideful. Um, they're really displaying all of their titles, or they're talking so much about their weight loss, or that they've done this and that and accomplished all these things. Like, oh gosh, they're so, prideful and proud of themselves. Like they're just so, whatever. But self-love and pride and self-esteem can sometimes get mixed in all together, and so we have to learn to make those divisions. But
mhm,
again, what I really like about IFS, or internal family systems, by Dr. Richard Swartz, is that he tells us there are no bad parts. Thus, even the part of us that is prideful is not a bad part. It's just a part of us through our evolution we have developed. And
mhm,
now it's a time for us to continue to develop that, to make it something else, or to even to retire that part of ourselves that no longer serves us.
mhm,
Because if we look at those parts like, oh my gosh, why am I so prideful? Oh my gosh, like I hate that part of me. That's completely counterproductive, because you're basically, hitting yourself, and that serves no purpose. We need to show compassion to ourselves, like, and to
mhm,
that part, and say, look at that part of us as if it were an exterior part of us, and say, pride, I appreciate what you've done so far for me in my life, but we need to move on to something else. And we need
mhm.
to learn to be more loving. We need to learn to be more compassionate, and whatever it is that your needs are for that time. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, yeah, I think that was a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter.
All righty. Well, thank you, Kirsten. And thank you, everyone who watched our live and those who have been following weekly. Next Saturday, October 23rd at 11 a.m. Eastern. Um, I'm sorry, there's one last little comment. Okay, anyway. Um, Next Saturday on October 23rd at 11 a.m. Eastern, please don't miss Marcelo Neto speaking about the ways in which Jesus illuminates our path.
Ooh.
Yeah, that'll be a great subject.
Mm.
Um, so, before we end our live, Kirsten, can you please say our final prayer?
It'd be my honor.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you. So, dear friends, with an open heart and immense gratitude, we thank our Creator, God. We thank our spirit mentors, our guides, and our like minded incarnate friends as well, for sharing their lofty vibrations of love and peace. We hope to continue sharing these vibrations, inspiring others, bringing hope to the darkness, shedding light to the darkness, bringing hope to those who've never known peace before. We pray that these teachings, these lessons of Spiritism, these universal teachings, are able to touch the hearts and minds of all of those who are ready and thirsty. And may we always carry Jesus, his teachings, and life lessons in our heart, always present as a guide. We thank you, and so be it.